Okay, everyone, I am going to get started now. First of all, thank you for coming and spending an hour with me, whether it's right now or later when you're watching the recording if you weren't able to make it today. So for those of you that I may not have had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Kim Kiesewetter, and I am part of the WiLS team, probably, obviously, at this point in time, since I've worked with many of you there, where I work as a data analyst and consultant, primarily partnering with our consulting team on a variety of research and data-driven projects in support of libraries across the beautiful state of Wisconsin. For a fun fact, that I will acknowledge, actually live in North Carolina and am one of the few WiLS staff members who doesn't reside in Wisconsin. That's why I'm wearing a tank top right now, because it is freakishly warm here right now. It's in the 80s. I refused to turn on the air conditioning and was a little warm here. My background academically, in terms of the training that I have received, is in the applied social sciences, sociology and anthropology specifically, with a focus on research, evaluation, and teaching. In fact, my first career-oriented job was working as a program evaluation manager for a nonprofit organization where I managed the entire evaluation process. I am super passionate and nerdy about all things research and data, but I have a particular special interest in assessment and evaluation. So I'm super stoked today to be able to share a little with y'all and hopefully provide you with some thoughts and inspirations for how incredibly valuable this process can be at your own organization, and to get you thinking about some ways you might want to bring that into the work you might be engaged in. So to situate our time together, we're going to dig into a number of items today to help create an introduction to assessment and evaluation, and how these tools can be beneficial to you at your organization in support of strategic decision making. I feel like it's really important to insert a caveat here before I get too far down the road, in that I am going to be sharing with you all a very basic overview. I studied evaluation in graduate school, and there are many super nuanced evaluation models and structures and all kinds of stuff there that I'm just not going to be addressing. And I share this in case you are familiar with those and are like, why didn't you talk about, formative and summative assessments and evaluations and all that? It's just too beyond the scope of a 1-hour introduction there. And for those of you who are not as familiar with assessment and evaluation, I share that to say that this will be a jumping off point to lots of different research that you might want to engage in. And if there's anything that I touch on here that you would like some more resources for, I work to be super accessible to everyone. So feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to pass along some additional resources there if there are certain aspects of this that you'd like to be pointed to a little more information about. So with that in mind, since we work primarily with libraries, this will be a very library heavy oriented session, but know that these processes that we're touching on can be used at any organization engaged in essentially any kind of project or endeavor. I've worked as an evaluator in many contexts, libraries included, but also child and adolescent mental health treatment facilities and K-12 STEM programs and colleges and all kinds of different places where I've been able to utilize these skills and tools. With that in mind, we're going to be looking at what assessment and evaluation are, just kind of a basic introduction to those concepts. We'll talk a little bit about when, how, and why we might want to conduct assessments and evaluations, and then we'll look at some basic inspirations for ways to get started with evaluation at your organization using a case scenario example. So before I get totally going, if you have questions during the presentation, I don't mind being interrupted. So if you drop your question in the chat, Andy is one of my colleagues. She's on here as well, and she'll be checking the chat for me. So I'm happy to answer your question, especially if it's related to what I'm talking about right in that moment, and I can clarify it. You can also save questions for the end. I'll try to hold at least 5 minutes to be able to answer any more broad reaching questions that you might have. So just know that you're welcome to interrupt me if you need me to clarify anything as we go along. So let's get started here. I want to take a moment first to differentiate between assessment and evaluation, since people tend to use these words interchangeably, myself included sometimes. However, it's important to note that they are technically two different processes. So this is going to be a little jargony here, but it'll be helpful in understanding and kind of situating the rest of the presentation. So just bear with me a little bit. Assessments tend to focus on measuring individual knowledge, skills, attitudes, beliefs, and things of that nature. So for example, let's say you were going to be offering a training to your staff members on a new software that you're going to be rolling out to support your summer reading program. A pre-post survey of what staff knew about the software before and then after the training could be one way to assess what staff members learned from that training session. In other words, you're assessing what was learned by individuals who participated in this specific training event. This process tends to be much more formative in nature and less about making a judgment. So for example, by conducting that staff assessment, it might highlight gaps in knowledge that could be addressed before you moved forward, right? You're not just going to be like, oh, they didn't learn what they needed to, if the purpose of the training was to make sure people had the skills that they need to be able to successfully use the software. So in that situation, an assessment can highlight any gaps in knowledge that could then be addressed moving forward to make sure everybody had the baseline knowledge that they needed to be successful. Evaluation, on the other hand, tends to focus more broadly on an entire effort or initiative and is much more product oriented. So in this context, it's sort of an overarching view of a project or initiative, and it's designed to make a judgment, unlike an assessment, by gauging the success of that endeavor and reaching overarching goals and objectives that were identified as a part of that initiative. So while you might have assessed what staff learned at that software training, you might decide to evaluate the impact of the entirety of using this new software platform over the course of implementing changes to your summer reading program. You might include the staff assessment as part of that evaluation, but the evaluation would be broader reaching than just that assessment in order to develop a judgment about both the strengths and any challenges of this implementation at your library to support that summer reading program that we're using as the hypothetical example. So you might look at data in addition to that staff assessment of how many participants you had before you rolled out this software program and any other changes that you might be doing. You might do a survey with community members' experiences with the new software to see their feedback and how they felt about the changes there. You might track other associated metrics that might have been impacted by this new initiative. So things like library visits or checkouts or program attendance, whatever might be on your radar is anything that could potentially have been impacted by this change. So when all is said and done, all of that information would come together to lead to a judgment of the degree of success that was achieved with the new software as part of an evaluation of that overarching initiative that was done. You might want to consider things like the cost effectiveness, how much did we spend versus how much the needle is moved, as well as other factors to reach an ultimate judgment. Today, we're going to be focusing more heavily on evaluations. I'm going to be taking this example that I just gave you and really fleshing out how you would do that using a case scenario example. But I wanted to take a moment here on the front end to differentiate between the terms assessment and evaluation, just because I think it's helpful to understand the ways that those different terms are used in the research world there. So they are absolutely related activities, but they also are distinct when technically speaking. So I am a nerd. Before I start walking you through how to do evaluation stuff, I am very aware that most people do not get as excited about evaluation as I do. In fact, if not viewed simply as just cumbersome and potentially boring activity, evaluation can elicit feelings of discomfort and fear even for some people. What if we evaluate something and it says something bad? I want to take time here early on to try to persuade you that evaluation doesn't have to be particularly cumbersome. You have to plan proactively, but it can be very manageable. It doesn't have to be too boring. I'm probably the wrong person to judge on that since I love research and data and all of that stuff there. And it definitely doesn't have to be scary. You also do not need to be a professional researcher or evaluator to conduct your own effective evaluations at your organization. So when it comes to evaluations being viewed as sort of these wily, expensive endeavors, many people tend to picture, when they hear that term, large-scale evaluations, usually ones that are being conducted by what's known as an independent evaluator on behalf of a funding entity, normally a big one like the government or a foundation. An independent evaluator is someone who comes in to evaluate a program at an organization they're not employed by. And that's because it's viewed as being more objective to have someone externally come in and look things over. I have worked as an independent evaluator numerous times where I'm this kind of outsider of sorts who comes in to evaluate programs. And these type of evaluations are usually required by funding entities who want to have some level of independent oversight over how monies were being spent and kind of the subsequent impacts there. These types of evaluations can feel like a project is being graded because evaluation is ultimately a judgment about the success of an endeavor. However, it's important to note that evaluations, even in these bigger contexts, tend to be very nuanced. And the goal of them, even though they're making judgments, is to highlight both strengths and challenges of large-scale initiatives to provide data and information about what worked and didn't so other people know what kinds of strategies might be effective at their own organizations when this information is being shared out. So yes, there is a cost consideration here, especially for federal entities and other big funders of wanting to make sure that monies are being spent as agreed. However, there's also that bigger picture value here of creating a longer term look at best practices, which are a strength of evaluations and being able to create data to identify evidence-based information about initiatives that are working or not working. So when we're looking at evaluations, even these larger scale ones, it is absolutely okay and expected for an evaluation to show both areas where an organization knocked it out of the park in terms of success, as well as areas where there's room for continued growth and development. I have this super heavy on my brain since I've been working on Wisconsin's Library Services and Technology Act, LSTA, 5-year plan evaluation with the consulting team here at WiLS. And as part of receiving LSTA monies, each state is required to do an evaluation of how they spent the money and what they did and the effectiveness of the plan that they created for how they're going to spend that money. And they're required to use an independent evaluator to do that. Yes, of course, to create a consistent level of accountability for the money that they allocate to each state and territory, but also by creating a consistent structure for the evaluation and publishing them all on their website for public consumption. They've created a repository of information where everyone can see in every state's 5-year plan what initiatives worked well and what ones didn't work as well. And this information can be super helpful in providing inspiration and ideas for other states in spending out their own LSTA funds by providing data on strengths and challenges of different plans there. So in other words, strong, effective evaluations are almost always going to show both wins and pain points, and that's okay. And that's how we can all collectively learn and grow, especially if we harness this information in our planning and our own endeavors, and then gather our own assessments and evaluative data to really see where we end up. So these bigger scale evaluations by places like IMLS, NSF, Department of Ed, can be really helpful for people even at smaller scale planning by providing a starting point of insights and data into how similar efforts to ones you might be embarking on have gone in other places. In addition, evaluation doesn't need to just happen at that large scale level, and that's not what I'm going to be focusing on today. In fact, I'm hoping you leave the session today feeling a little more confident about how smaller scale, lower stakes, inexpensive evaluation efforts can be really powerful and beneficial at the organizational level, since that's going to be the focus here. You can evaluate a lot You can evaluate your children's programming efforts on an ongoing basis. You can evaluate your summer reading programs. You can evaluate your internet connectivity project. You can evaluate your bookmobile and outreach efforts. You can evaluate new initiatives like workforce development programs, hiring a new social worker for your library. In fact, I would encourage you that there's likely value in evaluating many of these items, and that evaluating them might be less time intensive and expensive than you might think, but that it does require taking some time and intentionality and planning on the front end. Anything that you spend time or money on at an organization, especially if it's a new endeavor, taking that time to evaluate it can really help illuminate what's working and what might need to be tweaked. Way too often things get implemented and then they just kind of exist, right? And the chance that an evaluation indicated that something about the effort didn't work or wasn't working at impacting anything, while perhaps disappointing, I would make the argument that it's good to know that, right? If we're spending our money on something, if we're spending our time, if we're requiring staff to participate in something, and none of the data shows that it's having the kind of impact that we would hope that it would have, it can be helpful to know that in maybe either tweaking that program or moving those efforts, time, money, energy into trying something that might move the needle a little bit more. And that's where that data piece, I want to encourage you not to be afraid of bad findings. They're not bad. It's helpful to know where strengths are and where challenges are. And evaluation can give us that data to really know beyond just kind of a gut sense check, which is what a lot of us rely on. I think there's probably more initiatives and programs out there that just exist for the sake of existing, that there really hasn't been an evaluation to show that it's evidence-based in terms of what it's doing for our organization. And that's true not just in libraries, across the board, business in general. So with that in mind, let's take the question posed in the session title, should we do this? And run with a specific example that I can use as a thread through the rest of the presentation. So just from my work with a number of different libraries, I know a burgeoning area of concern for libraries across the country, Wisconsin included, is the need for social services support essentially at the library for patrons and community members who are entering the space. And that's led to consideration of if libraries should partner with, or in some cases even hire, their own social workers to be present in the facility, either some of the time or full time. We're going to use this as our example for a full evaluation design that you might want to make, but please note that these steps ideas can be applied to any program or initiative. Just trying to anchor this in a real world example so it doesn't feel like totally abstract concepts as we go along. So the first step is always planning. This is the worst, most boring step that no one wants to do, but the most important one for sure. And it helps situate and make this a more meaningful endeavor if you take the time to be proactive. So whether you are embarking on a whole new project or you're thinking about how to evaluate an existing endeavor that you might have, pausing for a moment to engage in proactive planning can go a long ways to making sure that whatever evaluation design you come up with feels manageable. Evaluation planning ideally occurs before you implement an initiative or project, but just know that you can revisit existing programs at any point in time to begin the evaluation process. There's just some backwards planning that might have to occur if something's already in existence. And sometimes you might have to revisit aspects of implementation to allow for assessment and evaluation to occur if implementation didn't account for that when it was originally rolled out. So with that in mind, before we do anything, we want to pause and do some basic information gathering to determine feasibility above all else, as well as to clarify the project itself. And it's very easy for people to get excited about hot button topics that are worthy endeavors. It may make a lot of sense to engage in without doing a little research about what it might look like at an individual organization. So some key questions to consider during the information gathering phase before you even start designing an evaluation for an initiative would be, first, what information and data already exists from other organizations who might have done similar efforts that we can review. So using the library social worker example, hop on Google. Do you have listservs and networks of other librarians, and have any of them produced research or data that you could review to see what they did, how it worked, and what the outcomes were? The next goal is, if this is an identified program, the next question is, if this is an identified program, what is the goal of this initiative? So if you want to partner with or hire and have access to a librarian, a social worker in your library, what's going to be the goal of that? What's going to happen because you have access to that? What problem is it addressing? So starting to really articulate a goal is going to be really important for the evaluation phase, which you'll see here in a moment why. Related to that, you want to take a moment to take stock of what baseline data, what information you might already have access to at your organization to help support planning, implementing, and ultimately evaluating a program using the goals as a framework. So if you're trying to hire a social worker to handle incidents of patrons in distress and other things that might be happening, do you have data, documentation, any kind of records there that might be able to provide additional information in support of this initiative and kind of help situate what your evaluation plan would look like as you roll this initiative out? The last question to ask is one you should ask before you do anything, which is, how much time, money, and staffing capacity do we have to implement an evaluation? I know many of you would say none. We are maxed out. And therein lies the challenge, of course, of doing evaluation, is it is asking people to spend a little more time, energy, and in some cases money on the front end of something, with the caveat being that the goal of evaluation is actually to help you streamline and be more efficient and be able to dedicate your time and energy to things that you know with confidence, with data, are working, and that you have that information in front of you and you're able to utilize it in program planning and advocacy, and in making sure that things are going the way that you would hope it would be by rolling out an initiative there. So this is also a point on the front end where if you can't find any existing data from other programs, you don't have any baseline to review, there's just nothing there, you're just cold shooting into the dark, you want to pause and consider if it might be valuable to conduct what's known as a needs assessment. And I'm not going to get super into detail about needs assessments, but a needs assessment essentially is an opportunity to collect preliminary data that point at any gaps between what's currently going on and what you're desired to have happen. Especially if a new initiative is going to be costly, spending the much smaller amount of time and energy to take a couple months to do a needs assessment first can make sure a project makes sense in terms of the limited resources many of us work with in regards to time, cost, and community need desire. This is also, from a cultural competency perspective, important because a lot of times initiatives that happen by organizations, well-intentioned organizations, nonprofits, and people who are doing community advocacy work, is that people who work in the organization can design a program based on a need they see, and they want to implement it with this kind of deficit model of what's going on with a specific community. And taking the time to do a needs assessment can help highlight there if that community wants that help, right? If people don't want you coming in and doing certain things, making sure that you're able to partner with people and that it's something that the community wants and needs is important, because you need community support in order to really make effective community change when we're thinking about institutions like libraries and schools and stuff that are really foundational parts of their community. I actually do have the chat box up, and Rosa, that's a great question. It can really depend. Ideally, needs assessments, I've done a number of them, take 2 to 3 months. It would be my best guess in terms of like the average of what I've done with different community members there, but it can be as simple as a community survey that's being done, hosting listening sessions, focus groups. But in other words, you're gathering data there from people who would be impacted by your initiative to assess to what extent they want it. And then on top of that, you can gather other community markers, census data showing different things like poverty rates, family composition, racial and ethnic stuff. You can look at crime data. You can look at substance abuse and alcohol abuse data for your community. I mean, there's so many different things that you might want to gather there if you didn't have an easy place to find it, to be like, okay, this is why we need to do this, and here's the data to support that there. So going back to that social worker example, I lost my train of thought for a second. Okay, going back to that social worker example, a needs assessment could be done via a few different methods if you didn't have data to support it. So just off the top of my head, thinking about this example, you might want to do a community survey about people's interest in and support for the initiative and what they might hope to see occur as a result of its implementation, and to highlight any concerns they see about it that might not be on your radar already, which can be really helpful, because then you're able to address those concerns and moving forward. You might want to, for another example, have staff track incidents where they would have liked to have the resource of a social worker present. And that can be done through simple counts to get an idea of how many times monthly, for example, staff were engaging with situations where they would have liked to have that resource there. That's another piece of pretty easy data that can help provide information on the need that might exist there. So in this scenario, a needs assessment could be done over just a few months to establish the need for the support of the initiative if you didn't already have that data and couldn't find other information in the broader community to really point to it, so that you felt going into it like, yes, we have what we need, we're ready for the next step. So once you've done your information gathering and the needs assessment, if you determined that you wanted or needed to conduct that step, it's time to create an evaluation plan. I cannot emphasize enough that finishing a project and then deciding to evaluate without having had any consistent data collection in support of the evaluation is not ideal. And I've walked into more than a few projects like that. And so I share here that waiting to consider evaluation to the end, or at least once a program is in full swing, can be really challenging and limiting. Almost every time I've gone into a project where it was already in existence and then they needed to think about evaluation, they're like, well, we'll get it going and then we'll think about evaluation. There's almost always one, if not multiple items that just can't be done because it wasn't planned for at the beginning. So baseline data, for example, which is data that you might use for comparison about what was going on in a community before, and then implementing something and then comparing it at the end to that same data if there's any changes there. It's very hard to get baseline data on certain things once you've started implementing something, right? It's going to influence those numbers potentially. So having a plan on the front end of a new initiative is really beneficial. That's not to scare you away from evaluating something that already exists. It happens a lot, but just to say that I cannot emphasize enough how much planning can make evaluation meaningful, not cumbersome. It can feel like an integrated part of the project. And can also make sure that you aren't limited in what you can do because you haven't done anything yet, and you're able to set up those systems to get the information that you might want to have. There might be things, like I said, that you just cannot gather retroactively. So the plan on the front end is really helpful in saving time and energy when it comes to actually evaluating things at the end. In fact, a well-designed evaluation should feel like a part of the actual project implementation versus a sort of add-on feel after the fact, which is how a lot of data collection I know feels like for people. I have a project and then suddenly someone's like, let me collect this data. So integrating those processes into your project, especially if you're going to be relying on other people to collect data for you, can be really helpful in not making it feel like you're adding more work onto something. It's just a part of that initiative. It's not something additional that's being added on top. So revisiting the example used of having staff track incidents for that social worker example is a pretty straightforward count if you plan ahead for it. This would mean before you implemented anything to gather baseline data, you would want to create a consistent form. It can be super simple for tracking, and then you would want to instruct and train any and all staff that would be involved in this on what it is and why you would like them to do it, how it will be used. Think super simple. I'm often the one as an independent evaluator coming into people's brainstorming and actually trying to bring them down. I'm like, it can be much simpler than this, which is an important part of the process. So in this example, it could be a Google Sheet. It could be a Google form that's super basic, like give me the date and time, give me your name, and just write up a quick little sentence of what happened. And that all would feed into a spreadsheet. And then you'd be able to look at all the dates and just quickly be like, on a weekly basis, we're averaging this many incidents, or on a monthly basis, whatever the situation is there of what you're tracking. You can then add a reminder to staff meetings to keep it fresh in people's minds. And this is something that should take minutes for a staff member to do. However, you can see if you didn't plan for this on the front end and you decided, oh, well, we do want to know this information maybe a year into a project or even a few months into it, the ability to get that data in real time doesn't exist anymore. And the substitutes that you might be able to do instead are just going to be a little less reliable. If you're asking staff to recall how many incidents they think happened, that's way more subjective than having people collect information in real time, which does involve some level of perception, but doesn't require people remembering things that may have happened and not knowing what date it was and all of that kind of stuff there. So having that plan on the front end can allow for you to have the right data for a defined period of time, collected in as consistent a manner as possible. And so with that in mind, my mantra is always just plan, plan, plan. If you spend the right amount of time planning, the rest of it should feel pretty straightforward. And like I said, in a lot of ways, it should feel just like a thread that's already integrated into your project, not this extra thing on top of everyone's already incredibly busy lives. So let's talk about basic evaluation plan steps. So I'm going to walk through these, and then I will show you some of this stuff in action with that example of the library social worker initiative there. So the first step that you want to take is to go back to a few slides ago when I said you want to have a goal for your project. You want to have that goal written out, so that when it comes time to doing the evaluation plan, the first thing that you're going to do is what's known as operationalizing your goal. That means that you're making sure that your goal is fully defined, it's fully explained, and it involves measurable components where you'll actually be able to tell if you achieved the goal or not with data. That's where that measurement piece comes in there. So when I'm creating an evaluation plan, I take the overarching goal or mission of the project. And sometimes projects can have multiple goals, that's okay, but we'll think small and tight for this example. So when I have this overarching goal, I'm going to create what are known as objectives that relate to that goal, that are specific, measurable, and that nest under that goal. And like I said, I'm going to give you an example here in a minute. Objectives are going to be really tight statements about the results that you plan to achieve. So the emphasis here is on being as specific as possible. Think who, what, where, when, how. All objectives should relate directly back to that goal as clearly as possible. And I want to emphasize here with objectives how important measurability is. In other words, how can you assess or evaluate that objective in reality? What data would you need to determine if this objective was achieved or not? You want to actually stop and ask yourself with each question you identify, how would we get this information? Would it be possible to get this information? So let's say, for example, and this is an intentionally bad objective, that we had an objective that said, community members feel more supported by the library through access to a social worker. That doesn't sound bad in theory, right? We want people to feel supported by the library. With this initiative, we want them to have access to a social worker, and we want our community to find value in that. But the first question I ask when I see goals and objectives like that is, how can we measure that? It's not so easy. The first question I have when I see an objective like that is, who are community members and how are you going to reach them to find out if they felt more supported by the library? Are you going to talk to every single person in your community? Is that feasible? Is everybody in your community coming to your library and interacting with the social worker? Let's hope not. So there's things you want to think about there in terms of the feasibility of the who that's being included in that goal. What does supported mean in this context? And how would you measure support? What about access? Does it matter how often, if at all, a person interacted with the social worker? And if so, how can you count for that? So in other words, in this objective, it wasn't specific enough and it wasn't measurable enough. A stronger objective would be something that was more specific, more clear, and involves something that's more measurable. So you might want to scope, for example, from community members to patrons, and you might want to put a specific time frame on the objective so that you have a window you're focused on. So maybe you want to allow for a year of implementation with the social worker project. And then you want to look specifically at patrons who visited the library during 2022. That's more focused and more specific than community members, and it might give you ideas of ways you could reach that group a little bit more easily for the evaluation purposes. Once again, you might want to take that idea of feel more supported by the library and turn it into specific feelings, behaviors, actions that you hope people would have as a result of rolling out this initiative here. So does it mean that patrons view the library as a safe and welcoming space? Is it a place to come to find resources, practical resources, both in terms of materials, services, as well as from people? Do they view the library as having subject matter expertise in this realm and know that they can come here for this type of support and help? What unique support is a social worker bringing into this environment? So there's many more questions we can ask here, but this is just kind of to give you an idea of the process of what I walk people through when I'm working with them and helping them develop specific measurable goals and objectives, and how important that can be in helping you evaluate what happened. Because if you plan on the front end and you have an idea of how you're going to do this and it feels feasible, it can be a lot more, there's a lot more confidence involved in implementing it and feeling like you can gather that information. The second step is taking those defined goals and objectives once you have them and taking stock of what your team views as success in this project. This is what will really set you up for your evaluation. When I go in and I'm helping somebody with a full evaluation process, I want the team to define what success is. I don't do that as an evaluator. That's something we co-create together. So looking at that goal and objectives, getting to that specific measurable stuff, sitting back with that information and being like, okay, well, what's success going to look like at year 1? What's success going to look like at year 2? And documenting that together can really help people feel like it's achievable. They understand what they're doing. They know what they're working towards, and they've taken the time on the front end to make sure it feels something like something that's achievable there. I see the question, Rosa, in the chat, and I am going to walk you through that. But yes, that's an excellent question here. Of even my example there is pretty subjective. There are, to go in the weeds a little bit, a lot of good research instruments that are already validated and reliable for gathering information on human behavior. And that's typically where I'll walk people towards if they're trying to get at things that are more subjective. That comes more from the psychology realm, but there's a lot of community building assets and stuff where people have worked at developing instruments to try and gather information on some of that more subjective information. But you'll see in a second with the examples I give you that I walk away from more subjective stuff to more concrete examples exactly for that reason. So success, like I said, it's really good to not be afraid of evaluation and to set goals that feel like, or to set a vision of success that feels achievable for your organization. So with those steps completed, you want to figure out what evaluation questions your evaluation efforts are going to answer. Your objectives, if you write them right, are going to be the most obvious place for that, right? Did we do it? We said we would do X or Y. Did that happen in terms of the objectives there? So if you've written those clear objectives with specific outputs, those are going to be a clear place for your evaluation plan to help determine if the goals and associated objectives. So if you had an objective that says at least 75% of flagged incidents by staff were reported and followed up on the social worker in 2022, that is a very tight, very specific, very measurable objective. Your evaluation question would be, well, did they? Did it get reduced by 75%? And of course, you want to have planned for how you're going to collect that information before you start doing it. In addition to answering your objectives, there's also broader evaluation questions that you might want to ask that are just kind of inherent process and implementation questions about your project. As many of you who have probably implemented initiatives they don't always go according to plan, do they? So having an evaluation question that takes a moment to see what went the way you thought it would and what didn't can also be a helpful thing. So there's lots of different evaluation questions that you might want to account for, broader impacts, other metrics that might be impacted, like DPI annual report data items, et cetera, et cetera. So once you have your goals and objectives, you have your evaluation questions, you've thought about what success is going to look like for your initiative, you can then consider your evaluation methods. How are you going to track progress? This can be done through so many different avenues, but I'm going to hit on kind of the high level ones that probably most of us have at least heard of, if not been involved in. Surveys, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, community conversations, just counting and tracking information, budgetary information, census and other community data indicators, poverty rates, home ownership rates. I mean, the list goes on. There can be so many things that you might want to look at in terms of methods that might make sense for giving you information there. You also want to take, at this point in time, a moment to identify who's going to be responsible for and involved in each evaluation method. So once again, make sure it feels reasonable with staff capacity and other such constraints. So you can make something really small, low stakes, inexpensive, and it can provide helpful information. Evaluation designs, normally what I would want to do in a dream world is never what's actually feasible, and that's okay. So it's always that kind of cost benefit of how can we get the most information that's going to be helpful for us with the constraints that come from living in a world where we don't have endless time, money, staffing, etc. Once we have all of that stuff together, we want to have a timeline. When is the broad start and end points here? Looking at those evaluation questions and methods, when is data collection going to need to occur? And then who is responsible for making sure that it happens? It's also really important, if possible, on the front end, if you're doing planning for evaluation, to schedule regularly check-ins, depending on how long the project is, either monthly, quarterly, biannually, whatever, so that any issues in keeping the plan on track are able to be addressed before it's too late. So I have worked on a project where an entity really did an amazing evaluation plan, but they didn't do any check-ins, the ball got dropped, and so that plan wasn't very helpful when at the end, nothing in it had essentially happened. So making sure that there's regular check-ins to make sure that if the ball does get dropped, which happens, right? I mean, there's staff turnover, these things happen, those things happen, that's totally fine and acceptable, but then you want to have that moment to be like, oh, like last month we didn't quite get what we needed to, let's pick it up this month so that the whole thing doesn't kind of just fall apart and then your planning was done for nothing. So we're going to run with our example more now. So we will assume for imagination's sake that you've done all your information gathering and it's towards moving forward with this project. We're ready. We've done that information. We're ready to go. So I've created just an example goal and objectives to get us going. Please. No, these are not perfect and they are absolutely not exhaustive, but I just wanted to get us a little bit of a list of things that we could play with for examples purposes. So I made up a goal. It's pretty broad. It's pretty squishy, but it's stuff that we could create objectives to make more measurable, which is what you want from a goal. So the goal that I created was to meet the social service needs of community members by providing access to a licensed social worker at the library. Objective 1 that would nest under that is where we're going to get to that specific measurable piece of the pie. So objective 1 that I created was to reduce the number of incidents of people in distress at the library by 30% during the first year. The second objective is to reduce the number of calls for security or police assistance by 30% during the first year. And the third is to improve community members' perception of the library being a safe and welcoming space to visit during the first year. Like I said, I'm just pulling these out of my head. I'm not thinking of any specific library or incidents there, but just to give you an idea of what tight, focused, measurable objectives would look like. So we would then use our objectives at a minimum to guide our evaluation questions. So since these objectives are specific and measurable, we can determine to what extent each objective has been achieved. And as an easy place, that can be where we start with our evaluation questions. In addition, like I said, we might have other evaluation questions we want to consider. So those might be things like, how did implementation go with hiring and training a social worker? Are there demographic groups who are more or less likely to utilize a library social worker? And if so, identifying them could be helpful in future planning and outreach efforts, right? Maybe there's ways that you could partner with another organization to address needs for that particular community there. So once we have those questions fleshed out a little bit more, we want to pick our methods. So here's just some inspirations for different ways you might want to decide to gather data to track progress on each objective. To be clear, when it comes to evaluation design and methods, there really is no right or wrong answer per se, but there is definitely better and worse fit ones. So you want to consider what will get you the information that you need, of course, above all else. But then you also want to account for, is this going to be too cumbersome or overwhelming for people to do? You may decide that you want or need to use more than one method to track progress on a single objective, and that's okay. Also, it's totally fine to have just one method that you're using there too. This is where you have a lot of freedom, a lot of latitude to pick what makes the most sense for you at your organization, with your initiative, with the constraints that you have there, and create something that feels manageable, feasible, while also giving you some information that you can work with to evaluate the effectiveness of the time, energy, money that went into rolling out the initiative. So with this first example, with this first objective, you can see that I put a few inspirations for evaluation methods there. So the first objective that I made up was to reduce the number of incidents of people in distress at the library by 30% during the first year. Counts goes back to what I said with that example of tracking. So maybe as part of this, you decide that you're going to implement that staff just need to track when incidents happen, that there's an incident report. So counts of those incident reports over time could be how you evaluate that objective solely. So if you started gathering this for a few months, before you implemented your project, and then you have your project for X amount of time, you can look at monthly how those incidents change. And you might find other trends that are helpful, right? There's really weird things like how good weather can influence people's behavior and stuff. So you may find that in the summer, things get a little rowdier than other times of the year. All of that can be really helpful data and understanding what's going on in your community, how it's interacting with what's going on in your library, and how a social worker might be impacting information there. But you wouldn't be able to know it if you didn't have the data collected. Another area, another evaluation method that might be helpful in assessing this objective would be to be doing a staff perception survey or a staff focus group with staff members at your library. How do they feel about this? What do they need help or support with? What kind of things have been going on that have led to this initiative being considered? What kinds of just questions, etc., are people coming in, needing help, whatever, where it'd be helpful. So having that data can be meaningful as well. And staff perception surveys can be done as a pre-post, right? Like, how are staff feeling about this now before we start this? And then you can ask some or all of those same questions at a year into it to see movement there. That's data as well. Staff's concerns, they feel more supported by, in directorship because they had this year. There's lots of different ways you can use that data to be meaningful as well. A patron survey might be another thing there. If this is something that you think might be impacting visits to the library and people's interest in coming to the building because of concerns around things there. A patron or community survey could be another place where you might want to do a pre-post to see if there's movements in people's perception of the library there. Those are just examples. They're not exhaustive. There's other things that I could come up with there, but just to help you see how there's different ways you can get that information. None of them is right or wrong, and some of them might resonate with you more than others, and then some of them might just be a timepiece, right? You might be like, we don't have time to implement an incident report tracking system, but we can do a pre-post survey. Or maybe you don't care about the pre-post survey. You're like, we really need to have incident reports. So that's where internally you figure out what feels right with your organization there. But regardless, if you've planned on the front end, you're able to have this information that's a thread throughout your experience there. We also want to consider what these evaluation methods look like by identifying any responsible people involved in creating the data collection methods. So if you're going to do tracking of incidents, who's going to create the form, who's going to train staff on it, and who's going to make sure that staff feel like they have the capacity that's getting used, who's going to check in on it. And then at the end of the year, who's going to take that data and how is it going to be organized? So thinking about that on the front end can be really helpful. With a survey, do you have someone who can design a survey? What survey platform are you going to use? There's free ones, there's paid ones. You know, thinking through all of that kind of stuff on the front end can be really helpful too. Oops, I didn't mean to move forward to the next slide. And just making sure that everything you do nests inside the fact that it requires human power to get it done. So making sure it feels feasible and possible to get that done there. Similarly with a focus group, do you have someone who can facilitate those? Where are you going to find the people that you're going to invite to that? And accounting for all of that can really help you scope the project appropriately so that it aligns with the capacity that you have at your library as much as possible. Once you've identified the methods, who's going to collect the data, the next thing that you want to think about is the timeline, right? To make sure that things stay happening there. So I wrote many of these objectives as if this project would be evaluated after the first year. This doesn't mean that the evaluation calendar the evaluation has to stop then, right? But that might be when we want to have our first check-in there and can kind of roll forward to think about next steps that we might want to consider as well. So once you have this evaluation plan, once you've implemented it, once you collected the data for whatever specified period of time you identified in your timeline, as long as you stick to this plan, you should reach a point in time where it's time to evaluate. Yay! If your planning was robust, this phase should actually be pretty relatively clear and not super time intensive, right? You've done all the time intensive stuff, planning, collecting, creating the systems, and integrating it into your initiative to make sure that when it's time to do an annual evaluation, that it's ready to go. You know where the data is, you know it's been collected, you know who's responsible for it, and you know what you're looking for, you know, in terms of success, challenges, etc., to just kind of go down the list. Boom, boom, boom. What worked, what didn't work. So while the focus of this session is not data analysis, you do want to consider those skills you have, and if you might need additional subject matter support there, that's the one area where I think a lot of people tend to get the most nervous is about, you know, making sure they understand how to analyze their data. But a number of these things like surveys and counts and things like that don't require a sophisticated level of analysis. You know, there's things that you can do to just clearly look for shifts or changes there. However, assuming everything was accounted for there, the actual evaluation, like I said, should hopefully be less work than all the planning that goes into getting that information and timeline vitalized. The data you identified in your plan should help you situate your findings about what worked and what didn't. So revisiting that example one last time, we might have met achievement on some of the objectives and not others, and that is okay, incredibly helpful to know. So while you might have reduced the number of people in distress at the library according to your tracking, maybe the number of phone calls didn't go down. That doesn't mean your program was a failure. It's helpful information to know. Why didn't those calls go down? Is it something that is already stable and low already, and that just wasn't something that really could move? Maybe there isn't room for movement there. Or are there additional strategies that might help in the second year to address that objective specifically? Ongoing evaluation here, as you can hopefully see, is not about grading the initiative. You're not saying, you know, pass, fail here, but instead it's about collecting and creating and curating a really nuanced look about different components of an initiative and what really worked and what didn't work. And at the end of it, you kind of are making one of three determinations. You're deciding we should keep doing this. We have the data, it worked. The second is we should keep doing this, but we need to make some adjustments. So maybe the data supports that there was positive movement, but there are some areas that you want to tweak or change in the next year to create even more movement or improvement and reevaluate the next year. Or three, you might decide we shouldn't keep doing this. And that is okay. And that is okay. In all three situations, thanks to the evaluation, you now have data to back your play. You're not relying on inference, you're not relying on guesses, you're not relying on gut checks, which are all legitimate, but are not going to be as good for advocacy. If you want to write a grant, if you want to write a journal article, if you want to share what you learned with other people, having that information can be really powerful in saying, we did this, we collected information on it, and we had all of these outcomes. We reduced the number of incidents in our library. We reduced the number of times the police or security was called. We increased the community's perception of our library as a safe and welcoming place through a community survey that we did. So having all of that information in your hands can be really helpful for sharing with partners who might be thinking about implementing a similar initiative, and you're helping save others time, energy, etc., and positioning yourselves as a sort of subject matter expert about your own experience by having all of this information there. You also now have a solid data set you can use for advocacy with city councils, with board members, with funding entities, where you're able to kind of highlight the strengths and impacts of your initiative there, while also having in your back pocket any challenges that you might have faced and the ability to reevaluate those the next year. So this was more like a WiLSWorld, like culottes. I know I just threw a lot of information at you really, really fast, but I did promise to try to hold 5 minutes at the end. So I wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions that I could answer for y'all. I don't hear any questions, and I don't see any in chat. So I want to say, if you need to move forward with your day, to feel free to, but I'll stay on for a few more minutes in case anybody does have any questions that they want to ask. But thank you all so much for coming. I hope you were able to pull something of interest there to get your brain going about something that I am very passionate about. And like I said, feel free to reach out if there's any questions, thoughts, inspirations, resources you would like to be pointed to for evaluation specifically.
Kim, there is a question in the chat from Rose. Can you provide resources for evaluation tools?
Yes, can you email me, Rosa, and I will gladly send you some links to some things that I find really, really helpful for doing that. So thank you.